Okay, as I just get this set up momentarily for you here, we're going to be turning today to talk about a different empire in Asia. We talked about the Ming Empire in Asia. I'm filming this one, so do not be alarmed if you see my face in enormous profile here. But what I want to do today is to talk about a different, as I said, to talk about a different empire, the Mughal Empire. Okay. The Mughal Empire in India, which is a little bit later than the Ming Empire in China, but raises some of the same issues, same questions, same themes that we discussed a little bit about with the Ming last time. There's a couple of things about the Mughals that we ought to keep in mind. But I'm going to start here. Does anyone know what this is? It's a war elephant. Yes. I know it's an elephant. Yes, now you're right. It's a cougar. No. War elephants are like the tanks of the 1500s in South Asia, in India. They're not a Mughal invention. We'll talk a little bit about where the Mughals come from. They come from near what's now modern Afghanistan. But the Mughals take great advantage of what other Indian princes and warriors had been doing in using elephants as basically fighting machines. War elephants were trained and bred in a very specific way. They were not bred to be friendly, to be sort of gentle creatures. One of the favorite ways that Mughal emperors got rid of their rivals was executing them by having an elephant step on their head. This is not something that your friendly pachyderm is inclined to do. But these are ill-tempered ones. And I want to talk about the Mughal Empire today in terms of a war elephant. Because war elephants are extremely valuable. They are like tanks. When you read descriptions of when the first soldiers, either in the First World War or the Second World War, encountered tanks, especially the Second World War, when the Germans rolled out some tanks that just literally made people feel sort of faint when they saw them. When they saw, sorry? Blitzkrieg, but the Germans had tanks called the Tiger and the Panther in particular, that were thickly armored, really almost sort of, it seemed to people, almost sort of invincible. The war elephant has the same effect on a battlefield. It can move fairly quickly. It's armored. It gives a great vantage point from which you can use a spear, for which an archer can be based. All of these things make it a very useful weapon. But there are some, you might say, drawbacks. And what I want to talk about today is that governing the Mughal Empire, putting together and governing and administering the Mughal Empire, is a lot like using a war elephant. If it is done well, it repays you enormously. That is, if you bring the elephant up a certain way, if you take care in putting the armor on the elephant. Think about this. There were people who basically, family occupations were, they put armor on elephants. Not elephants who were necessarily happy to be there. It's a very skillful sort of process. It requires a great deal of skill. If you can accomplish all that, you've got the training, you've got the armor, you've got people who know how to control an elephant in the middle of battle too, then you have something really formidable. If you mess up, the elephant steps on your head. Whether because someone orders him to or he just sort of feels like it. That is, putting armor on an elephant, as I said, is a very delicate task. If you mess it up, you yourself can be destroyed. And that's the thing about the Mughal Empire. It is a very complicated piece of machinery. It is a very complicated piece of administration and governance. It requires a great deal of skill. If you do it well, it gives you huge rewards. If you mess, even with one sort of way of doing it, the whole thing could potentially fall apart. So that's why I bring up the war elephant. Not only because war elephants may be sort of the coolest thing ever, but also because war elephant as metaphor. Something that if done well, gives you great rewards. But something that if you don't pay attention to, your mind drifts off, you neglect to do a certain thing, or even if you do things in the wrong order, can be absolutely catastrophic. So that's what I want to think about. The Mughal Empire can in some ways be understood through this process. And the war elephant is in some ways the symbol. The Mughals don't bring it to India. They find it in India, but they make enormous use of it once they get there. So let's start talking about the Mughal Empire in a little bit of detail. In the first place, the Mughal Empire is going to differ from Ming China in some significant ways. In the first place, the Ming Chinese Empire emerges out of a rebellion. That is, Hongwu and the southern Chinese are able to drive the Mongols out of China. It's different in the case of the Mughals. The Mughals, which is spelled Mughal, the Mughals are not from South Asia. The Mughals have their origins in Central Asia, specifically in and around Afghanistan. The Mughals or the Mughal dynasty that emerges in the 13 and 1400s in Central Asia has ties in particular to the Mongol Empire through kinship. That's one of the reasons they were called the Mughals. People tried to sort of say that they were like the Mongols, or may have at times almost called them Mongols, but it got mistranslated or misspelled or misread as Mughals. They're very powerful in Central Asia, and starting in the late 1400s and early 1500s, they begin to look to take over South Asia, this particular region up in here. This is a region that is dominated by a very prosperous agriculture. Northern India, up through what's now part of modern-day Pakistan, sort of northern India, modern Pakistan. This is an area that is extremely well irrigated. Multiple rivers, multiple river systems, all of which get their water from the snowmelt in the Himalayas or the Hindu Kush Mountains. You can see them all the way running up here on the border, what's basically the border between India and China over here. All of that snowmelt, all of that water feeds into northern India, provides enormous amounts of not just sort of water for crops, but floods rivers, creates silt, creates fairly rich soil when the rivers reduce in size, provides transport. It's a prize. For the Mughals, capturing this area means capturing an enormous amount of very valuable land. And as I said, starting in the late 1400s and the early 1500s, a series of Mughals begin to push into India. They come down through Afghanistan, all the way down here through a passage in the mountains known as the Khyber Pass, don't worry about that name, and begin to assert control over parts of northern India. So they are a force coming from outside. That's the first thing we have to understand. Unlike the Ming, which is in essence sort of a revolution from within, against an outsider. The second thing is that the Mughals are an Islamic dynasty. Islam is not new in South Asia by the early 1500s, but Islam is not the majority faith of people in this part of the world. The vast majority of people in this part of the world are Hindus. Muslims then, and to this day, make up only about 10 to 12% of the population. So they are members of, or sort of participants in, a faith that is not indigenous here, and a faith that is not the one practiced by the majority of Indians. These are things that are going to make sort of, you might think, Mughal conquest, and then conquest is easy. As I said, conquering's easy, ruling is hard. For the Mughals, the conquest goes pretty easily. There are a few hiccups in the middle of the 1500s. But by and large, by the 1550s, the Mughals control most of northern India. So they are from outside. They are an Islamic empire. They also are literally conquerors. That is, in this region of northern India, you have lots of local rulers, princes, nobles, aristocrats, warriors, all of whom are basically subjugated or subordinated by the Mughals. So it's not only the case that they come from outside, they are members of a faith that is a minority in this part of the world, but they have also displaced the existing power structure. In fact, they've displaced multiple existing power structures. Local kingdoms, local principalities, all have been defeated or have surrendered, even before they sort of faced them in battle, have surrendered to the Mughals. That's another thing that's going to be an obstacle for the Mughals to consolidate their rule. They're outsiders in several different ways. Jacob.
I don't know if this is a question, but were empires given a name, or did they choose their name?
We call this the Mughal Empire. I mean, these people were known to themselves as the Mughals, but they didn't walk around saying the Mughal Empire. They called it basically our empire, or our kingdom. We tended to, usually it's more in sort of retrospect that people will call it the Mughal Empire. And this is something more that historians are more sort of comfortable with than people at the time would have been. Rather, the people at the time would have said, basically, this is ours. This is our kingdom. This is our land. Yep.
How Turco-Mongol is the average Mughal?
The Mughals are a combination. That is, the Mughals from Central Asia, and so in terms of sort of ethnic groups, the Mughals derive from both people in like Afghanistan, people who are Pashtun or Pathan, people who are potentially more related to the Mongols, related to East Asians. They also have a significant number of people who are ethnically, or there's a significant slice of the population that's ethnically related to the Turks or to the Turkomans. That is, people whose ethnicity and language looks back to sort of Turkey, but people who have become sort of scattered throughout Central Asia over a period of about 1,000 years. They also will, as we'll talk about, they will also intermarry enormously in India itself. But they do speak, they rely in particular for the language of their court, they rely on Persian. That is one of the things they do is they bring Persian, or as we now call them, Iranian bureaucrats and civil servants with them. That is, the court language is not, they're Islamic, the court language is not Arabic, the court language is Persian. But they will bring people of sort of Turkish descent and particularly of Persian descent with them, who have been sort of recruited to the Mughal Empire as bureaucrats. So you have this force that comes in. As I said, there are some ups and downs. The first Mughal conqueror in the early 1500s is a man named Babur. B-A-B-U-R. Babur extends control to about here, to about what's now near sort of the modern cities of Delhi and Agra. Babur is succeeded in the 1540s by his son. That's a Y, believe it or not. Whose name is Humayun. 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 Humayun is a disaster. He manages to lose a significant amount of territory, actually gets chased, quite literally, back to Afghanistan, and then dies in an opium-induced stupor by falling down the stairs of his own observatory. Humayun's career is brief and inglorious. But Humayun's son is the one who will come to be known as the Great Mughal, or the greatest of the Mughals. And his name is Akbar. That's the name he takes on becoming emperor, Akbar meaning great. So you can't call him Akbar the Great because that's simply calling him Great the Great. But his name is Akbar. He's only about 12 years old when he becomes the Mughal emperor. But he is without a doubt the most successful Mughal of them all. There are several elements about Akbar. In the first place, although he is 12, and although he operates within a court culture, a government, or you might say sort of a social culture around him that can be very bloody and very violent, he manages to survive into his late teens. No one plots against him. It's a rarity. There are several reasons for this. One was that Humayun didn't have many children, so there weren't many heirs around to plot against him. The second is that Humayun actually had some protectors in the court. People who, either because they perceived some strength in him, or because they figured he was the best of the available successors, aligned with him and protected him. The third thing is this. There were people in the Mughal court, and Akbar was among them, who believed that Akbar was in some ways ordained divinely. That is, that God wanted Akbar to rule. And they drew this not out of sort of, Akbar's lineage or what he looked like physically, but out of one specific thing. From the time he was about 10 or 11, Akbar used to go into these sort of trances. He would speak, but no one could understand what he was saying. They only lasted, at most, about 20 minutes. But they convinced Akbar, and they convinced people around him that these were moments in which Akbar was in essence sort of being lifted out of his body. God was talking to Akbar, God was instructing Akbar. What almost all historians of the Mughal Empire now agree is that Akbar was an epileptic. He was having seizures. But no one at the time was either knowledgeable about that or was willing to say, by the way, the emperor he's not divine, he's just having seizures. Then they call for an elephant and you get your head stomped off. These things are really sort of, quite useful to have an elephant hanging outside the court. You have, therefore, people who believe that Akbar is sort of divine, or at least semi-divine, and worthy of protection. And that gets him through his teenage years, where he can also begin to demonstrate that he's actually very brave, he's physically very tough. I talked last time about the time he's around 18 years old and someone at court displeased him and he picked him up, literally, this older man, carried him up 4 floors, threw him on to the courtyard below, killed him, but just to make sure, picked him up, went up again, and threw him down again. Again, nothing like reinforcing a point. So Akbar manages to sort of survive into his teens, no mean feat, given the way in which Mughal court culture could be at times, but he also begins to develop into a soldier, someone who demonstrates certain qualities of leadership and of bravery and of military intelligence or military sort of skill. And starting in the early 1550s, he begins to push back. And ultimately, by about 1560, has conquered or reconquered all of this territory. He gets all the way to the eastern side of India. Further than his father or grandfather had actually gone. One of the very sensible things he does is he says, okay, I've conquered all of this area here, darker blue area here. I'm not going south. Up here is where all the best land is. Up here is where all the people are. There's not much down here. This is the area of India I mentioned. It's kind of like desert. They depend on the monsoon every year for rain. It's much more sparsely populated. It's much harder to get around. It's more mountainous. It's dry. It's desert-like. He sees absolutely no reason to take it over. That, in essence, it's going to cost more than it's worth. There's not enough people, there's not enough agriculture down there to generate tax revenue that would cover the costs of administering and patrolling and conquering this area. So unlike one of his successors, who we'll be talking about, he does not go further south. He halts. And instead, from the early 1560s on, begins to consolidate rule. This is Akbar who understands that you have to do all sorts of things if you're going to rule over this empire where there are multiple religions, multiple languages. You are a person coming from the outside. You are a person who has displaced ruling elites. For example, the princes in this part of northwestern India who are known as the Rajputs. So Akbar, once he's got this conquest done, Akbar is very interested in pursuing consolidation of government. He's a little bit like Hong Wu, in a sense that this is a person who on his own, not simply based on what his advisors tell him, but on his own says there are certain things we need to do. In the first place, he says we've got to demonstrate power. That's very important. You don't hide away. I don't think he knew about the Forbidden City, or maybe heard of it or something like that. But he's going to take the opposite approach. That is, there are going to be multiple representations of Akbar painted. As you can see here, this is I have to blow this up a lot so that it's not quite as clear as I would hope. But Akbar is oftentimes portrayed as sort of a saint. He's got this halo. We'll talk more about the specifics of this picture in a few minutes. But it's Akbar as, again, this person who's sort of semi-divine. Akbar's going to make the Mughal Empire part of South Asia. This Central Asian dynasty, he wants to basically say, it's a South Asian empire now. The Mughals belong. He'll do this in several ways. He'll stage major processions. He'll build forts throughout northern India that he will take his court to for periodic tours. People will see. And it's an impressive sight. They travel on elephants. They travel with an enormous number of horses, even camels, being used to carry everything that accompanied the Mughal emperor, his wives, his children, his advisors, his relatives, as they moved from court to court. He kept everybody important with him. No one was allowed to go off on their own and do their own thing. That, he understood, was not conducive to keeping control. Basically, keep your friends close, keep your enemies, or your potential enemies, even closer. So they travel around, they visit forts, and he builds forts. He has forts built in various parts of northern India. He does things like this. He builds a tomb for his father, Humayun. Humayun didn't really, based simply on his record, qualify for this extravagant of a tomb, but he got it anyways. Humayun hadn't died in Delhi, hadn't died in north-central India, but this is where Akbar decides to build his tomb. Right in Delhi, has Humayun's body exhumed and reburied here at the center of this. Does this resemble anything else that the Mughals were going to start building? The Taj Mahal. Yep, this is in some ways seen as a blueprint for the Taj Mahal. It's right in what's called Old Delhi today. It has gardens. At certain times you get these sort of trenches are filled with water. It's very elaborate, also very symmetrical. It's nothing compared to the Taj Mahal, but you can see sort of the outline of the Taj Mahal in it. One of the things that Akbar is trying to do in building this tomb is to relocate the Mughals in India itself. He says, this is where we bury our dead. This is where we build our forts. In essence, we are now rooted in this soil rather than coming from outside. So he's trying to establish a physical presence for the Mughal Empire. He's trying to show the might and the power and the wealth. And he's also trying to sort of change the way people will look at the Mughals. The fancy word would be to indigenize. That is, to make it look as though the Mughals are naturally or are sort of unquestionably from this part of the world. It's about locating them now in India rather than up in Afghanistan or Central Asia. So he builds his tomb. As I said, he builds multiple forts. That's not the only thing he's going to do, though. Let me just give you a couple of other. This is the fort. Again, I had to blow these up. These are from. Sorry, not sure what I did there. All right. I blew these up from some of my own pictures, and they did not, as you can see, move very well. This is in New Delhi. It's called the Red Fort, or modern-day Delhi. This is a detail inside the fort at a place called Agra, A-G-R-A, which is the place where a later emperor built the Taj Mahal. In this fort, the emperor, Akbar in particular, would hold court. That is, these processions were not simply designed to move around his empire and show his power, but he interacted with local notables. He settled disputes. He appointed people to certain positions within his court or his government or his military. So for Akbar, the big thing is to keep the emperor always in touch. Whenever the Mughal army went off on a military campaign, Akbar went with them. History is replete with examples of emperors who have a general go and fight, or rulers who say to a general, go take care of this. The general comes back and says, by the way, I now have my own army. Think, for example, of Julius Caesar. Sent off to conquer Gaul, comes back and says, I think I'd like to run the place. Who says that? Me and my army, right here. The Mughal emperor, Ottoman emperors in what's now Turkey, they were renowned for going with their armies. Not necessarily because they relished going to war at every single moment, some of them did, but because they didn't trust the army the minute it got out of sight. Better to stay with it than to sort of trust it on its own. So you have this elaborate sort of architectural program that Akbar is engaged in. There are other things that he's going to do as well. In the first place, Akbar is going to co-opt a lot of these nobles, these princes, Maharajas, these Rajputs in particular, who were displaced when the Mughals arrived. He's going to give them jobs. He's going to come up with an elaborate system called the Mansab system, M-A-N-S-A-B, the Mansab system. Mansab literally means rank or place. And what happens is, after the Mughals conquer, after Akbar has reconquered northern India fully, he has his civil servants go out and compile a lot of information on the various nobles who've been defeated. The ones who have acceded to his rule. That is, they've either been defeated in the field or they've just simply surrendered. He says, how many horses do they have? How much food could they provide to an army? What sort of wealth do they have? Where do they live? How many people could they recruit in an emergency? And what he does is that they rank them. It's actually a decimal system. Everyone's given a certain number of points on a 10-point, or using sort of 10-point increments. And based on where you stand in terms of the resources you have, the power you have, the local influence and wealth that you have, you get a rank. The higher the rank, the higher the amount, or the greater the amount that the Mughal emperor will pay you every year to basically stay ready. These people are not going to become the Mughals' regular army. They're not going to become generals in the Mughals' regular army. They're going to get an annual salary from the imperial government. And what it does is this. These salaries are pretty good. The Mughals are pretty wealthy. It allows the Mughals to keep these princes and nobles fairly satisfied. That is, we talked last time about this concept of reciprocity. That it's one thing to rule through power, but if you don't get people to buy in at least a little bit, you're always going to have to rely solely on power. Akbar understands that. He understands you've got a lot of potentially disaffected people out there in northern India. So what does he do? In some ways, he buys them off. He gives them annual salaries. He tells them, keep a certain amount of material, horses, men ready to be called up by the emperor in the case of emergency, in the case of war, things like that. But it's designed to allow these guys to continue to live sort of good lives, wealthy lives, and not lose status in their local communities. That is, people who believe that they're losing their economic position, their social position, those are dangerous people in an empire. So he creates this sort of opportunity for them. He encourages, and he himself does, he encourages marriage, and he himself marries into the family, or families, of these local notables. One of his wives is the daughter of a North Indian Rajput prince. And basically, he's tying these families to his. He's basically marrying with, creating alliances with these families. He recruits a lot of people in India. They bring all these Persian and Turkish bureaucrats with them, but he also recruits a lot of people in northern India who had served these nobles as administrators, as tax collectors, as clerks, and things like that. He recruits them into the Mughal government. Again, he's going to keep around him a close circle of advisors, almost all of whom are people who are Mughals with Central Asian roots, whose families have been aligned with his for generations. But outside of it, he's bringing in these people who come to be known as the Mansabs, or Mansabdars. Don't worry about that. It means basically the rank holders, Mansabdars. But these people who have this rank, people who are brought into the bureaucracy, people who get tied by family relationships to the Mughals. He understands it's very important to make the Mughals sort of indigenous, to tie them into existing structures. Any questions about this so far? Yeah, Amy.
It's kind of an off-topic question, but when you talk about the processions,
Yeah.
it sounds a lot like King Henry's court in England.
Yeah.
Did they have any connections, or did they, like with the West and India, were they kind of connected at all, or did it just happen that they both?
Well, it sort of just happens because, I mean, lots of different monarchs and government systems and emperors throughout history have realized that displaying your power is good. But yeah, I mean, there is, they did have actually some contact, not necessarily Akbar. Yeah, Akbar, by the time Akbar is controlling most of northern India, the Portuguese are starting to make inroads on the Indian coast. Akbar and the Mughals don't care about trade. They care about controlling land. So they're happy for the Portuguese to start coming in and taking over port cities as long as the Portuguese pay tribute to him. So Akbar will have contact with some people, but I don't think necessarily extensively in order to say, well, I'm copying this sort of practice. But yeah, I mean, this idea of sort of going on procession, or it was called the Royal Progress. I mean, it was, Henry did it. Elizabeth I was absolutely enamored of it. I mean, it was estimated she bankrupted dozens of noble families by basically showing up at the door. And, the monarch doesn't just show up. The monarch of 5,000 people show up and saying, well, you need to put us up for a month or two. It's a way of sort of getting out, shaking hands, meeting people, and destroying them economically at the same time. So again, it's part of this larger sort of way of basically showing your face, showing your power. But you're right, it's something that emperors have relied upon. I mean, you think about the Roman emperors who would come back from their conquests, bearing, slaves and the wild animals and all sorts of treasure and all these sorts of things to signify where they'd been and what they had done. In a similar way, you have, yes, within India, Akbar very conscious that this needs to be done. And needs to be done fairly consistently, moving from place to place at least a couple of times a year. So you have Akbar's attempt to sort of bring the Mughals into Indian society through marriage, through the appointment of bureaucrats, through basically paying these nobles to be sort of on standby. He's going to do even more than that, though. Akbar, very pragmatically and very personally, is interested in religion. Unsurprisingly, someone who believes that he's basically been divinely ordained and that God is, in essence, talking to him or moving him in some way during these seizures or spells, Akbar believes he has a specific mission religiously. He also believes, quite pragmatically, that he needs to deal with the question of religious diversity in his lands. Let me go back to sort of Akbar, and we'll go skip back to a couple of pictures here. Akbar, as I said, believes he has this sort of religious mission. Akbar grows up in Central Asia, influenced by, under the direction of, scholars who practice a certain form of Islam, clerics who practice a certain form of Islam, known as Sufism. Sufi Muslims, S-U-F-I. Which today is sort of the third largest sort of group within Islam, but by far the smallest. Maybe 1 or 2% of the world's Muslims today are Sufis. But Sufism is a very interesting form of Islam because it focuses much more than other strands within Islam on personal experience rather than the idea of sort of following rules, the idea of sticking to a certain code of behavior and religious observation. Rather, it argues that you can, in essence, sort of come to understand how God works in the world through personal experience. You can come to understand the existence of God through personal experience, especially through what they call ecstatic experience. That is, through heightening your senses, through dance and music and art, painting, poetry, all these sorts of things. Sufi Islam basically says you can get to this sort of, almost sort of communion with God through intense meditation, through things like intense dancing, through composing poetry and songs. That's the sort of Islam in which Akbar is trained, you might say, or is brought up. Sufism also, because it is very expansive, because it says, look, there's no proscribed one way to understand God. There's no proscribed one way to, in essence, come to appreciate God or come to believe in the existence of the divine. Because Sufis say that, Sufis actually don't say there's only one way. In fact, they cast within Islam itself the idea that there could be people on similar paths. Christians or Jews in Islam called people of the book, who were considered to be people who were allowed to practice if they paid sort of a fee or a fine, a tax. But there was truly one way, the Islamic way. For Sufis, that's not the case. For Sufis, the idea is any experience that gets you aware of God is a valid experience. Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, etc. The Islam that emerges in Central Asia and that it moves into northern India with the Mughals is an Islam which is very interested in reaching out to Hindus. And in fact, you start to see in northern India, in Akbar's time and after, sort of a movement of Muslims and Hindus sort of sharing religious traditions. This sort of fusion of Islam, a particular form of Islam, and Hinduism. Hinduism itself being very much about the personal experience of God and the notion that there are an infinite number of ways to experience God or to experience the divine. So this is what Akbar comes out of. Akbar comes out of this sort of tradition. He believes he has a sort of religious mission. He believes this mission that he's on is the unification of all faiths. Basically, get everyone to understand that there is this one God. Whatever name you call this God, however many sort of forms this God may take. Again, it goes right with Sufi Islam because it says, you may be doing this, but you're actually just, what we want to remind you is that in doing this, you are actually seeking the divine, and there's one divine. So Akbar believes he's got this sort of mission to unite all faiths by showing people that they are all actually engaged in the same thing. To eliminate religious difference. It's a rather mammoth sort of mission he's undertaking. But he believes he's got the sort of, this sort of divine sanction to do it. For a time in the 1560s, 1570s, he will try to form his own religion. He's going to build a specific fort or complex designed to sort of bring people together. He's going to bring representatives of every religion he can find, inside and outside of India there. He himself can't read, he's illiterate. So they have these massive sort of seminars almost of clerics and teachers and priests and others. There are pictures painted at the time that show, I'm not sure if I brought one or not, that show this sort of gathering. No, I don't have one. Let's see. That show these sorts of gatherings, and they show, for example, in some famous pictures, the presence of at least a couple of Catholic priests, missionaries who had arrived with the Portuguese in the 1540s and 1550s in India. one of the major sources, one of the major historical sort of descriptions of life at Akbar's court actually comes from these Jesuit priests, because they were required to write back monthly letters to Rome, to their headquarters, to say, what have we found here? What is going on? To sort of the displeasure of some people in Rome, it turned out the Jesuits actually really, really liked everything they saw in India, in China, and in Japan. And the letters were less about how many converts they're making and more about, have you seen the architecture of this place? But you have this coming together, and Akbar trying to put together this one religion. It doesn't really take off. There's a little bit, people are not quite willing to follow Akbar that far. It's hard to put together your own religion. But in pragmatic terms, Akbar translates his belief that he's got this sort of mission to unify faiths, that he's got to sort of eliminate friction between religious groups. And, of course, he's got to rule as an Islamic ruler in a predominantly non-Islamic region. He also takes some pragmatic steps. The big one is this. I mentioned this concept of the people of the book. In the Islamic world, in the Mediterranean, the Near East, at this time, in the Middle Ages and after, Jews and Christians in particular, people who practiced other faiths, were allowed to practice. But they had to pay a certain tax. It had various sorts of names to it. They were allowed to practice, but they had to pay a certain tax. And the idea was, even for someone like Akbar, if you are governing a place where there are people who practice another faith, you can allow them to practice it so long as they pay the tax. In the case of northern India, it would be predominantly Hindus who would be paying this tax. The tax, the Mughal word for the tax was jizya, Jizya. Basically, you might say, these Islamic states and the Mughals before Akbar had a system of what might be called religious toleration. Religious toleration. It's not the same thing as religious freedom. Religious freedom means you can practice your faith without having to pay a tax, without having to do any sort of, deal with the government, without having any conditions imposed upon you. That's religious freedom. What Akbar does is in 1579, he gets rid of this tax. He says, if you want to practice your faith, whatever your faith is, you do not have to pay the jizya tax. Instead, go and practice. He's hoping on one level that this is going to encourage people to come together and realize how much they have in common religiously. From a more practical standpoint, it's a way of saying, look, I understand that I'm a ruler from a minority faith. I am not going to make your life more difficult by continuing this tax system. So what he's doing is he's opening, you might say, a period of complete religious freedom in the Mughal Empire. It won't last. Exactly 100 years later, in 1679, his great-grandson is going to reimpose this tax. But for Akbar, eliminating this tax makes sense both in his own sort of idea of a personal mission, and it makes sense in the idea of, you might say, reciprocity. Not placing too many burdens on the people. So you've got this sense of Akbar coming in, co-opting local elites, joining local families, recruiting local workers, making his presence felt physically, establishing an element of reciprocity by eliminating the tax on non-Muslim practice. And one other thing that Akbar will do, and this again looks sort of like Hong Wu, Akbar will establish a much more intensive system of tax collection. A unified and thorough way to collect the revenue, to collect the money necessary to sustain Mughal rule. He's going to appoint local tax collectors. They were called the Divan, or the Divani. A tax collector was a Divan, D-I-W-A-N, a Divan. he divided northern India up into provinces. Each province had a governor, who was sort of the military ruler of the province. Each province had a divan, a tax collector. The Mughals built something into their tax collection system, though. They built in a lot of autonomy for the people who collected the taxes. That is, the Mughals didn't come in and say, we're collecting one straight rate, one straight price or amount, one straight percentage. Rather, the divans in each region were allowed to adjust the tax rate according to local conditions. Bad harvests, rising food prices meant they would lower taxes. Huge harvests, lower food prices, an increase in trade throughout northern India, that meant they might raise taxes a little bit. For the Mughals, this is fundamentally important, it was better to have some revenue coming all the time than to try and get all possible revenue all the time. That if you tried to squeeze people too much, eventually the money would dry up. So the idea was, you build in a system which does a couple of things. It ensures that the Mughals are going to get some money at least every year. And it ensures that people don't see the Mughal emperor as taking every single penny they've got, or every single rupee they've got, but instead, that the Mughal emperor is sort of responsive. The Mughal emperor cares. Not really, but the Mughal emperor understands that, sometimes you can pay more in taxes, sometimes you can pay less in taxes. So that's something else that Akbar does. There's one other element. As I said, this is like, it's like the war elephant metaphor. That is that there's a lot of complicated stuff that goes on. The other thing that Akbar does is he constructs a huge intelligence system in his lands. In northern India, you don't have a lot of people who can read and write. In villages, in towns, you might only have a couple of people. Those people were often employed to help people conduct business, transactions, arrange marriages, arrange for people to travel to different regions. They were known quite literally as letter writers. And each town, each village had maybe one or two people who could do this. And if you wanted to send something to someone in another village, you would do it. You'd go to this guy, the letter writer, he would have someone carry this letter to his counterpart in the other village, who would then read it to the intended person. What Akbar's government did is it basically paid all of these guys to send monthly letters to the Mughal government as well. What's going on? How are harvests? How are prices? How are these people who have these mansabs, these ranks, what are they doing? The Mughal system of government has all these sort of checks or safeguards within it. Yes, we'll give the princes these salaries for them to remain in some sort of military readiness, but of course we're going to be checking on them. We've got a military governor in the province, we've got people reporting in this sort of letter writing system. So you have this very sophisticated way of both asserting control and maintaining control, but also gaining legitimacy. It's something that Akbar himself is very much able to pull off. The problem, of course, is what do you do after Akbar? Akbar, among other things, of course, had his reputation as a military commander. He had this sort of image, or possessed this sort of image as a sort of divine person. If you think back to that earlier image of Akbar with the halo, one of the things there is that Akbar has got the lion and the lamb to lie down next to him. It's very Christian iconography. Similarly here, that is, Mughal painters would paint various sort of Christian images designed to encourage religious community, religious, you might say, interaction. This is, sort of a traditional nativity scene presented. One thing that's done, and it doesn't come out that well in this, is that one of the three kings who comes to visit the baby, who apparently was born at about 22 pounds, he's got blue skin. That's the god Vishnu. Or that's supposed to say to people, this is reminiscent of the god Vishnu. Again, the idea that these religious sort of interactions are very possible and in fact are desired. So you'd have Akbar painting himself as, or portraying himself as a Christian sort of saint, halo, lion and the lamb, you've got angels trumpeting up in the clouds in that picture. And here you have the notion that basically you've got Hindu deities coming to visit the baby Jesus. It's an attempt, a very sort of concerted and conscious attempt in the Mughal court under Akbar to encourage this sort of religious interaction and ultimately foster what he thinks will be, real religious unity. As I've mentioned, after Akbar, things get much more difficult. You don't have people who are seen as divine. You don't have people who have a reputation for conquest and military skill. And in fact, the story of the Mughal Empire in the 1600s, after Akbar's death in 1605, is one of what sort of seems to be, on the outside, an expansion of Mughal power and influence, but what really represents a weakening of Mughal position in South India. In South Asia. That is, Akbar's son, grandson, and great-grandson are all going to engage in things that ultimately weaken the power of the empire. I'm not going to ask you to know the names of all of these sons and grandsons, but I want to show you some of the things they do before we talk about his great-grandson, who's the one who basically, in essence, blows it all up. Akbar's immediate successor is his son Jahangir. Don't worry about the name. Jahangir and Jahangir's son, whose name is Shah Jahan, again, don't worry about it, they are not really military types. They are much more concerned with sort of the art and architecture of using the throne to be a great patron. They will build up even greater. This is a mosque that Shah Jahan builds in Delhi. Shah Jahan is the one who's responsible for bringing us the Taj Mahal, constructed in the 1630s and 1640s as a tomb for his late wife, Mumtaz. Both of these guys are much more concerned about what goes on inside their court than what's going on outside of India. Outside of the court, in the rest of India. One thing is this: Akbar had by and large occupied such a position that no one could challenge him in the court. His sons and grandsons don't have that. Akbar had multiple wives, he had multiple children, therefore multiple grandchildren. There's going to be much greater sort of controversy and much greater literal infighting in the court after Akbar dies. Yeah. Old age. Yeah, he was close to 70 years old when he died. I think it was some sort of pneumonia or influenza or something like that. But basically, he had lived for his day and age quite an extensively long time. None of his sons are going to live as long as Akbar, or none of his descendants will as emperor. You have a greater concentration, because there's sort of this intrigue, because there are multiple people at times plotting against the emperor after Akbar dies. These emperors become much more focused on what's going inside the court than going on outside. They're focused on what they like, which is art and architecture and cultural patronage. They don't pay a lot of attention to sort of making these processions. They don't travel as much. They tend to select one place or another as the center of their court, and they're going to stay there. They aren't engaged in any military ventures. They have at least somewhat absorbed the idea that they shouldn't go any further south from Akbar. So they start to spend a lot of money on these great artistic and architectural projects. They also become sort of more reclusive. They don't trust people in their court. They spend a lot more time sort of negotiating, trying to make sure they have enough allies at the court. It becomes a much more sort of introspective court. And there's something else that's going on as well. And this is especially true when you get to Akbar's grandson, Shah Jahan, building the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal, as I said, is intended as a tomb. It's intended as a memorial to his wife. But it's also something else. It's intended by Shah Jahan to be a marker of his devotion, of his religious fidelity. A marker of his, you might say, sort of Islamic orthodoxy, or the depth of his Islamic faith. The Taj Mahal is an explicitly Muslim piece of architecture. Not simply because it has sort of the hallmarks of Mughal design, but because quite literally, in the sort of black marble inlays around various entrances into the Taj Mahal, you have written verses from the Quran, which talk mostly about paradise, and talk mostly about paradise as a reward for those who follow God in this one particular way. It's even sort of inscribed on the entrance to the Taj Mahal, the gate that lets you into the large courtyard. In essence saying, there is one way but my way. Not quoting Shah Jahan, quoting God. And so it's a marker of his Islamic devotion. This is not something that you would have seen under Akbar. That is the much more sort of public association of the Mughals with one particular faith. That is, Akbar's successors become much more sort of devout Muslims, much less concerned with this idea of sort of unifying faiths than with promoting. They don't, at least until 1679, they don't bring back this tax on non-Muslims. They don't make it illegal to practice other religions. But they are moving towards identifying the Mughal court much more openly with Islam. And that's not going to make everyone in India comfortable. Because again, it is sort of saying that, in essence, there is one religion proper for India, proper for the Mughal Empire. That the emperor, the emperor doesn't have to forbid things to make more people feel that the empire is about one religion. It's simply doing things like this, overawing people, impressing them with the Taj Mahal, but also using this to demonstrate his own faith, and using this almost as a sort of a device for evangelizing or bringing people into Islam, by saying this is what paradise looks like. This is what God's world is like. It's not enough to save Shah Jahan from his own son. And that's the last guy we're going to talk about here. I'll give you another picture of the better picture of the sort of the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan's son is named Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb. He actually overthrows his father and imprisons him about a mile up the river from the Taj Mahal in a fort, where Shah Jahan spends the rest of his life supposedly gazing out and sighing, looking at the Taj Mahal. Aurangzeb takes as his own, that's his family name, takes as his own imperial name, or name as emperor, Alamgir, which means world conqueror. The name Shah Jahan had basically simply meant emperor. Alamgir means world conqueror. And Aurangzeb has a very different idea about what the Mughal Empire ought to be. In the first place, the Sufi influence at the Mughal court has declined. Other Islamic clerics have become more important over time. Aurangzeb grows up and is raised as a very devout and Orthodox Muslim. Having taken over at the end of the 1650s, by the end of the 1670s, he brings back the jizya tax, believing in part that this is what a true Muslim ruler should do. You don't forbid people from practicing religion, but you do make it conditional. He's got a couple of other things too. He believes that the way to sort of, project his power, to demonstrate his legitimacy, is to go out and start conquering again. He thinks that his forebears had sort of left Akbar's legacy. Of course, Akbar's legacy had basically been, don't go south. There's nothing there, it'll cost too much, you won't get anything out of it. Aurangzeb doesn't listen. And starting in the 1670s, he begins to invade southern India, the area not conquered by Akbar. By 1690, he has control of this area, but at enormous cost. Both, you might say, sort of financially and also politically and culturally. In order to engage, in order to defeat the people who live in this region, he's got to pour an enormous amount of resources into this region. Again, this is very difficult terrain. Those people who do live in this region largely live under the protection of certain, you might say, sort of warrior princes. They are renowned for their ability to use cavalry and to use horses to get around this terrain. They know this area intimately. It is very hard to bring a large army down and try and control this area. There's no place where you can fight this sort of massive pitched battle. Instead, you're going to have local powers, local rulers, princes and others, engaging in sort of hit-and-run attacks, guerrilla attacks, against a force which is attempting to occupy. These princes and others in southern India are not going to take on Aurangzeb directly, but they're going to try and fight sort of a war of attrition with him. Ultimately, he has a large enough army to win, but it costs a great deal. It takes him a long time to conquer. He has to move his court down to south-central India to basically supervise what the army's doing, because remember, you don't want to let the army get out of sight. He can't encourage people to resettle. He can't even encourage people at his own court to come down and resettle permanently in this area, to serve as military governor or tax collector. They want absolutely nothing to do with it. So you have a situation where he's taken this region, but there's not, as I said, there's not a lot of agricultural production there. There's not a lot of money to be made. There's not anything there to offset the cost of ruling this region. The result is that you have this decade-long, or couple of decades-long adventure by Aurangzeb, during which he neglects the rule of much of northern India. Not only is he not traveling around, he's basically moved the court very far to the south into this conquered territory to try and consolidate control of it. It costs a huge amount of money. He puts more and more demands, not only in his own army, but he puts demands on tax collectors, he puts demands on governors, he puts demands on these nobles who have these mansab designations. He wants them to produce for him. They're getting squeezed. And then in 1679, he tops that off by reintroducing the jizya tax, motivated both by his desire to sort of rule as he sees is proper for an Islamic ruler, and also to generate more money. But he's not around. He's making these demands that seem exorbitant, and people start to move away. People start disregarding. People start ignoring the Mughal emperor. You have local nobles or local notables like these Rajput princes who start trying to build up their own power base again. You have his own appointees who are governors of regions in northern India who are supposed to send tax money, who are supposed to be contributing to the war effort. They basically stop. They say, why should we send money down there? It's basically throwing money away. What's he going to do? Come up and come after us? That's not very likely. So in parts of northern India, these provinces that have been set up by Akbar, the governors, these Mughal appointees, basically start to declare themselves the rulers. They stop sending the tax money to the court and start holding on to it themselves. By the time Aurangzeb dies in 1707, the Mughal Empire occupies more territory than it's ever done before. But a lot of the places that the Mughals claim to control in northern India, no longer are they really in control. Rather, local elites, governors, tax collectors, and others have taken Aurangzeb's distraction, have taken his running down of the treasury, have taken his alienation of non-Muslims, and moved to create their own sort of small kingdoms, their own sort of provincial states. The actual Mughal emperor, the actual position of Mughal emperor, someone actually sitting on the Mughal throne, that will continue until 1858. But after Aurangzeb, there is a rapid decline. Ultimately, the Mughal emperor, by the early 1800s, is someone who simply owns a bunch of land around Delhi and has a very nice house. Not someone who commands any political authority. Because Aurangzeb in particular, takes the system that Akbar had created and says, I don't need to follow that. I don't need to think about going south. I don't need to maintain a policy of sort of reciprocity with non-Muslims. I don't need to make sure that the tax system is responsive. All I want to do is conquer. All I want to do is establish a state my way. And by doing that, he makes himself weaker. He opens up opportunities for other people to come and start chipping away at his power. And as I said, by 1707, the age of the great Mughal Empire is over. It is going into about a century and a half of inexorable and ultimately sort of terminal decline. All right, I'm going to leave that there. We're going to turn to different parts of the world next week. We will have another map quiz. If you still need the map packet, the study pack, please come up here and get it at the end of class. Thanks.